Tonight on Greater Boston, from the Boston Public Library, with money stretching thinner than ever as inflation hits yet another 40-year high. Should we have seen this coming? More importantly, do we know the path out? Is there a path out? Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers joins me on that. Then later, MSNBC Anchor Katy Tur joins me on her new memoir about growing up as the child of two fearless journalists, fear in her childhood home, and how she says her father prepared her for dealing with Donald Trump. It's not really news to anyone that inflation is hitting hard, but we learned on Friday that May marked yet another dismal record, with consumer prices up 8.6% compared with last year, the biggest increase in 40 years. Economists say the reasons run the gamut, from Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine to an American public eager to travel and spend after 2 years of lockdown. Still, speaking today at the AFL-CIO convention in Philadelphia, President Biden delivered a message of optimism about our collective economic futures.
Gas is up and food is up, which we're going to get down come hell or high water. This is America. We can do any damn thing we put our minds to. And guess what? We're not going back to the false promises of the trickle-down economics. We're going forward. We're going forward.
At least one man warned well over a year ago that we could be headed down this inflation path. That'd be former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who joins me now. Secretary Summers, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Very nice to be with you.
So, a historically high inflation, a recession may be in the offing. Does the dysfunction and deceit in Washington contribute to this, or is it just an unfortunate sideshow?
I don't think Washington has covered itself with glory. It's made a set of policy errors in 2021, particularly at the Fed, that contributed to this high rate of inflation. There's all kinds of legislation that would be desirable to help contain inflation by raising taxes on those who can afford to pay. That hasn't passed. There are common sense steps like taking a more strategic approach to China that would help reduce prices. We could be doing much better in Washington with better results for our economy. And frankly, the shambolic character of our democracy, as exemplified by what happened on January 6th, I think undermines confidence in our country and its institutions, and that certainly doesn't do any good for the economy.
Let's speak to the guy who actually won that election, going back to Philadelphia with President Biden, suggesting he had limited ability to deal with these economic problems and that the GOP was standing in the way. Here's a little bit more of what he had to say.
The problem is, Republicans in Congress are doing everything they can to stop my plans to bring down costs on ordinary families. That's why my plan is not finished and why the results aren't finished either. Jobs are back, but prices are still too high. COVID is down, but gas prices are up. Our work isn't done.
He also says, and I'm sure you've heard him say this, Secretary Summers, inflation is a global problem. It's Putin's inflation. Is he on point on all of these criticisms, analyses?
I don't think it's fair to blame all the inflation on Putin. We had inflation, and it was a serious problem well before President Putin moved into Ukraine, though that certainly made it a good deal worse. I think the context of the American situation and the context of the European situation is quite different. Natural gas is 4 times as expensive in Europe as it is here. They have to import all their fuels. We don't. So to say that they've got inflation like ours doesn't really exempt us from responsibility. But I do think the president is right that there has been very substantial obstructionism in the Congress, and that has made it harder to move the country forward.
Well, maybe the obstructionism precludes you from answering this question, but how long is inflation with us? How long till gas prices are no longer $5, $6, $7, $8 a gallon?
Gas prices specifically, that really does depend a lot on President Putin. That depends a lot on geopolitics, and it's hard to predict. But I'd be surprised if we had a return to normal in the next year. I think we're going to have substantially elevated prices. And I think with respect to inflation, it's probably going to be with us for a while. There are no miracle cures or silver bullets. Monetary policy, which what the Fed is doing belatedly, does work with respect to inflation, but it takes quite a while.
You sort of played Nostradamus, I would argue, in a February piece you wrote in the Washington Post last year. Let me read a little piece of it. President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan would represent the boldest act of microeconomic stabilization policy in U.S. history. Its ambition, its rejection of austerity, orthodoxy, and its commitment to reducing economic inequality are all admirable. But there is a chance that macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. You're a pretty smart guy, Larry Summers. You're not the only smart guy. Why were so many people so wrong about inflation being on the horizon?
I don't fully know. It did seem relatively clear to me. I think part of it is that after 40 years, when inflation was low and didn't vary much, people just thought that inflation was one of the constants and that you couldn't push it way up. And so they decided to push their luck. It's a little like a guy who's had a heart attack, who's very careful, and then after several decades decides he doesn't have to be so careful. And that's a bit how we were as a country as the inflation of the 1970s receded from view. I think that's an important part of it. An important part of it was the particular political dynamics, which, in order to hold a congressional coalition together when there were so many people who were against everything, forced the overall total to an unreasonable level.
You believe with inflation so high and unemployment so low that recession is more than likely. I'm correct. Is that not your position?
That is correct. Yeah, sure.
So for most people watching this show, recession is just a word. It's an ominous word, but just a word. What would that mean for low and moderate income people in this country should it happen?
It would mean that instead of having an extremely low level of layoffs, we would have an abnormally high level of layoffs. Instead of a situation where you can walk down Boylston Street and almost every establishment is looking to hire people, that most establishments would not be looking to hire people. It would mean, and we've already started to see some of this, that instead of people's 401ks going up every year, they would start to go down. So it would not be mean that the average family had lower incomes. But so it's a thing we very much want to avoid. But when you swing the pendulum too far in one direction, it often swings back hard. And I think that's a certain amount of what we've seen, along with a lot of bad luck.
Secretary, you've been fairly critical of the Fed. I think everybody watching knows they're meeting tomorrow, allegedly going to raise the interest rate to 0.5 point, 0.75 point. If I can for a second make you czar, not just of the Fed, but of the federal government, what would you do to rein in inflation and to shorten, if not avoid, a recession? I know you've touched on a couple things so far. What would be at the top of your list?
I'd make clear the Fed's determination to do necessary things with respect to inflation, and I'd raise interest rates, and I'd signal that I was prepared to do that until inflation went away. I'd raise taxes and cut prescription drug benefits, both of which would improve the budget, cut prescription drug prices. I'd maintain the benefits, both of which would operate to reduce the deficit, reduce demand, and hold prices down. I'd take a more strategic approach to China and reduce tariffs and express my concern about China's economy in other ways, like limiting outbound investment towards China. And those lower tariffs would translate into more purchasing power for American consumers. I would step up our investment across the board in energy. Renewables are absolutely essential for the future, but getting all the fossil fuels we can is crucial for this moment. And so I've taken across the board, yes, policy with respect to energy. And I'd recognize that in a moment of labor shortage, we've got to find ways of letting more workers get to work, which means helping people with kids take the leaves they need if they have jobs. And it also means accepting immigrants in larger scale than we've been willing to recently.
Can I return to one of those topics on your list for a second? There was a little Twitter pissing match, for lack of a better expression, between the president and the richest man in the world. I think he's the richest man in the world. I don't know who he is after the last few days, Jeff Bezos. The president saying something like, and I'm paraphrasing, you want to bring down inflation? Tax fairly the wealthiest corporations in America. The response from Bezos was something like, this is just a misdirection play. It has nothing to do with it. Whose side are you on?
I'm with the president on that one. I certainly have been critical of parts of his fiscal policy, but he's completely right that if you reduce the deficit and raise tax revenue, that's going to reduce spending, and that's going to reduce demand, and that's going to mean less inflation. And he's right that if you're looking for ways to raise revenue, it's a better idea to raise taxes on Jeff Bezos than it is to tax it on the people who work in your studio.
You know, before you go, if you could spend a minute on a couple of local things. I'm sure people watching know that in the early aughts, you were the president of Harvard University. The current president of Harvard University announced a couple of days ago, Larry Summers, he's leaving next year. How would you rate his tenure, Secretary?
I think Harvard will remember Larry with gratitude for many things, most especially for his enormously thoughtful stewardship of the university through the very difficult COVID period. He served well and with distinction.
And last thing, Larry Summers, and small bore, local, a couple of days ago, the the governor announced yet another sales tax holiday. Virtually every state does such a thing. Ours in Massachusetts, August 13th and 14th. The proponents argue that it helps stimulate spending. People will spend money. It'll help small businesses. People like me see it as political gimmickry and nothing more. Who's right on that one?
I'm closer to you than I am to the governor. I think these kinds of things are sort of addictive. And once you put them in place, people wait for them. And then you lose sales tax revenue, and it rewards people who spend their time parsing sales tax announcements relative to other people. So I don't think it's a particularly good idea. If that was the biggest mistake that our government was making, we'd be a better state and a better country.
Well, I think when the Secretary of the Treasury is pretty close to me, it's a perfect point to end this conversation. Secretary Summers, it's really good to see you. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Privileged to be with you.
Thanks. Millions know Katy Tur for her work with NBC and MSNBC, a frequent target of Donald Trump's, both during his campaign and his presidency. She's proven her journalistic grit over and over again. But now she's opening up about where it all began as the child of two fearless LA journalists who gained national fame for capturing some of the most iconic news moments of our time, from the O.J. Simpson white Bronco chase to the '92 LA riots. It's all laid out in the new memoir, Rough Draft, and trust me, it is rough at times. Katy Tur joins me now ahead of a stop at the great Brookline Booksmith this Thursday night. Katy, welcome and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Before we get to Rough Draft, I assume people know you wrote this wonderful book, an account of the 2016 Trump campaign. You covered him, you interviewed him, you were insulted by him. Little Katie was his obviously demeaning nickname for you. So you have a special vantage point on the first couple of days of these hearings. What do you take away from what you heard?
I think it's remarkable, and the case that they are laying out is so far pretty compelling. It's also just right out of the Trump playbook, what we've seen him do since we've seen him in his political life, which is when he doesn't like something, go out and search for the thing that agrees with his opinion of any event or any scenario. And the committee has done a really, I think, compelling job of laying out that he was told over and over again that the election was fair, that there was not fraud, and he found himself searching for anybody that would tell him otherwise. And according to the testimony, it seems he landed on Rudy Giuliani, who was intoxicated that night. I mean, that alone is a big deal, but then to go on and try to link it, as they have, to a broader grift, they're going there. They're going there, Jim.
You think Ivanka's out of the will by week's end, or a little bit longer?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. But, to see him throw her under the bus in that statement was, I guess it was kind of sad.
Well, I had other emotions, but okay. So most of us think we had helicopter parents. You actually had helicopter parents. I knew of them. I didn't know they were your parents till I read your book. Explain to people who they were, what they did.
My parents started a company called Los Angeles News Service in the 80s in Los Angeles, late 70s, actually. And they covered breaking news, at first from the ground, and then from an airplane. Didn't really work in an airplane, and then from a helicopter. Los Angeles is a big, sprawling city, and in order to get to a story while it's still happening, a helicopter is what you need. So they did that, and they you probably know them from the slow speed OJ pursuit. Yeah. They were the ones that founded OJ. From the Reginald Denny beating and the LA riots, the guy that got pulled out of the red gravel truck and beaten. Or from any police pursuit that you saw in LA in the 80s or 90s, or the Malibu fires. They shot it all.
You know, I love the image you paint of your mother practically hanging out of the helicopter to get the footage. She was the video.
You can see a photo of it over my shoulder right over there. My mom is hanging out of the helicopter.
Is that really true?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's pretty great.
It is true, yeah.
But your father really liked the spotlight, the plaudits. Was he comfortable sharing that with your mother, who was every bit the partner?
Oh, gosh. I think that my mom had she was more of a wallflower, and she was shyer. So for her, for a lot of the time when I've asked her about it, she said that she was comfortable letting him have the spotlight. But there were moments where it was not cool. I mean, she shot the video of the LA riots. She hung out of the helicopter as the guys in the street were shooting at the helicopter with guns. There was a bullet hole in the battery beneath her seat. And she didn't get the credit for it. I mean, they won an Emmy for that coverage, and her name was taken off of the Emmy to add some guys who were on the assignment desk. And I think that bothered her for a long time. And I tried to correct that record in the book because she did incredible things.
Well, the credit may not have been shared. What was shared, and this is really painful in your book, was violence and abuse directed at her, you, your sibling. Can you fill in some of those blanks for us? What was it like living in the Tur household when you were a kid?
Well, it was a lot, and it had its ups and it had its downs. It was, a helicopter flying in the air and then a helicopter in free fall. It could be a lot of fun. It was certainly interesting. I literally grew up in a helicopter. I was in a helicopter more than I was in my own bed. I saw Los Angeles from a vantage point that nobody else got. We got to have lunch at Catalina for the day, or in San Francisco. I mean, we did amazing things, and I had a lot of fun. But that fun was often coupled with terror and very scary moments. My dad was really young when I was born. My dad dealt with a lot of abuse from my grandfather, physical abuse and emotional abuse. And the news was really a stressful place. And all of that came out because my dad didn't deal with it in rage and sometimes physical violence. When I was young, he would punch the walls. and leave holes in the wall. He would throw batteries at my mother if she didn't do as good of a job as he wanted, or she wasn't listening right. He at times could get physical with my brother and I, but more than that, there was just a lot of yelling and a lot of anger, and it was hard. I ran away from it.
Yeah, you write that you made a list of the things he would throw at your mother, which really has stayed with me. You also write early in the book, Katy, that until this very moment, I've been avoiding my childhood and everything about it. Why did you stop? I'm a guy who doesn't like telling people what I had for lunch. You are so transparent and raw in this thing. Why did you decide to stop avoiding it?
Because it's a hell of a story. It really is a hell of a story. My parents did incredible things, and it made me who I am today. I'm a journalist. I've had some wild experiences covering the news, from plane crashes to political campaigns. And I was often asked, why didn't you quit when you covered Donald Trump? I mean, he directed the crowds at you. You got death threats. Why did you keep doing it? And in trying to figure out why, I had to look back, and it's partially because of the way my parents were journalists. So, I mean, why did I do it now? It's a hell of a story. I want my kids to know it. And in order to tell the story, I've got to tell it in full. And that means you're going to get the good with the bad.
And relive the pain. There's a little bit more than a little bit of Trump in your father. Is that not a fair statement?
Listen, they're not the same person. They don't have the same views. But if I write in the book, this is my clever one-liner, if they were looking for a therapist, I'd recommend the same one.
I was hoping I would get that one-liner. Thank you for that. Katy, 9 years, by the way, I'm doing this interview from the Boston Public Library, which is about 100 yards, as you know, from the finish line of the Boston Marathon. You're covering the bombing 9 years ago, and you get a call from your father. What does he tell you?
So my dad calls me. I'm there, and we had at this point a very tense relationship because of all that had happened in the past. And I'm very careful with pronouns here. You're going to have to give me a little space. He calls and he says, I'm not a he. I'm not Bob Tur. Bob Tur is dead. I'm Zoe Tur, or first it was Hannah, and I'm a woman, and this is my true self. And this is why I've been so angry, and everything is going to get a lot better now. And, in the moment, it threw me for a loop, and I didn't really feel like I had the vocabulary for it. And I'll be honest, in the moment, I didn't know how to switch the pronouns immediately, because I had lived for 30 years with somebody who identified as one person, and now this was changing. And it precipitated not the transition, but the confrontation that we had in trying to confront what Bob Tur did precipitated an even bigger break. And, it was not great, and it still isn't great.
I saw him on, I think it was the CBS Morning News, where I saw you interviewed the other day, that he loved you, and that and I'm paraphrasing, he hoped for a rapprochement. How did you react to what she had to say, your father had to say in that interview?
Well, it's always, any child will tell you that it's great to hear a parent say they love you. And I love hearing that. I didn't do this to be vindicated. I didn't do it to settle a score or to embarrass anybody. I just did it to tell the truth and to be authentic. And I'm always hopeful that things will get better. I'm hopeful for the future. I want my dad to be happy.
When you said you're hopeful for the future, I know you meant that in a personal way, but I just remembered you also wrote in either the introduction to your book or early on, you were afraid for the future of our country. Why are you afraid?
I am very afraid. And when I say I'm hopeful for the future, I've got to temper that for our future. I'm afraid because we can't seem to agree on the basics. We had a deadly pandemic, and we couldn't agree on life or death issues. We can't agree, it feels like, on whether the sky is blue. And that's scary to me, because you are now able to go wherever you want to hear whatever you want to hear. You don't have to tune into a nightly broadcast at 6:30 to find out what's going on in the country or the world. You can go to Facebook, or you can go to Twitter, or you can go to whatever news outlet you might go to. And because of that, you are hearing decidedly different versions of the same event. And some of them are just completely untrue versions of the same event. That scares me. I don't know how we get back to a place where we have a shared set of facts. And I'm hopeful that there is a larger part of the population that's out there that is going to say enough and be more vocal and active in politics so that we can get things back on track.
And when you watch that, when I was watching the hearings, we broadcast them here, and I watched every minute. What I was thinking about every minute with half my brain was what was being said, and trying to imagine with the other half of my brain, who is the person out there who until last Thursday night was a Trumpophile who was finally saying, aha, I just can't do this anymore. Can you identify that person in your mind?
You know, I don't know. And I think it's hard. I don't want to make a person's mind up for them. I think you should look more toward the person who has been disaffected with politics and looks at that and says, hey, listen, this is not okay. I've got to get involved. The lie has become so entrenched with people who love Donald Trump, so entrenched. And it gets reinforced by the people around Trump, by Trump himself, by certain cable news hosts, and by other politicians who are trying to draft off the president. And because it's so emphasized and so amplified, I think it's hard to break free of it.
Katy, before you go, when I met you a couple of minutes ago, I said both of your books were terrific, and they both could have been called unbelievable, because Rough Draft is unbelievable but true. What do you hope people take away from this the second memoir of yours?
I hope they're entertained. Honestly, I hope they're entertained, and I hope in the darker parts of it, because there's a lot of fun stuff, but I hope in the darker parts of it, I hope some people feel like they're being seen. I've heard from a lot of people since this book came out, or since it's only been a day, but I've heard from a lot of people who have read parts of it who've said, I went through something similar, and thank you, because I've always been scared to talk about it. I didn't expect that. I really did not expect that. And I'm so happy that it's landing that way. And also, I think it's a good way to think about the media and our landscape and how we got to where we are right now. There's some fun media analysis and some revelations or some reminders about Walter Cronkite in there as well. A tease.
I hope we get to talk about the media someday soon. Katy, really enjoyed the book and really enjoyed the time. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
Be well. Katy Tur's book is Rough Draft, and again, you can catch her in person at the Brookline Booksmith this Thursday at 6 p.m. That's it for tonight. Please come back tomorrow. King Boston's Amari Paris Jeffries will join me on honoring Juneteenth, its place in U.S. history, and Black Joy, plus the call for continued work toward racial justice. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe.